I'll just go through. Giles Budge, sitting next to me here, is head of science at FERA. Until a few months ago, that was a government agency. It's now in the private sector. Matthew Cosley, nobody mentioned cricket, from Australia. Richard Glass on the end, team leader for exposure studies at Eurofins, who do field trials. And Nick von Westenholz, next to me here, from the Crop Protection Association. We're talking about the negative perceptions of pesticides and genetically modified crops. So I just want to start by briefly asking, and we'll start at this end, how would you describe how people perceive GM and pesticides? What does Mr. and Mrs. Joe Public, what do they think?
I think in general there's a lot of mistrust, and people don't really understand what the dangers might be with pesticides and GM technology. So when they read something in the press, then they selectively believe what's written. They don't see some of the good or some of the bad, and they're very selective in what they read and what they understand. So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of the science behind both areas.
Charles?
Well, for me, I think that people hear the word pesticide and they think chemical, and chemicals are bad, right? Especially synthetic chemicals. Natural chemicals might be good, synthetic chemicals bad. So perhaps there's a negative perception around the words that are used to describe these things. When it comes to GM's a new technology, and for me, I guess it's more about people's fear of new technologies rather than GM, perhaps. So perhaps it's more of a general issue with new technology and not understanding something and therefore being fearful of it.
Nick?
I would agree with what's been said so far. I think actually there's a difference in the way that pesticides and GM are being perceived at the moment, certainly in the UK. And it may be because actually pesticides are seen unfairly as an old technology. You know, they've been around for a while and people are familiar with them. GM is seen as a new technology. And I think there has been a change in the UK in the last, say, 5 or so years in terms of perceptions of GM, and I think it's much more balanced and equivocal. It's certainly not widespread acceptance, but I think the view of sort of frankenfoods and that sort of those sort of portrayals no longer have as much traction. I would say just one other thing: we sometimes miss the point that actually I think large tracts of the public don't really think very much about these issues at all. They're much more concerned about, health or education or national security, etc. And I think we need to bear that in mind sometimes. Very easy from within the industry, presuming that everybody's taking these issues as seriously as we do, and actually being then surprised when people seem not to really know what's going on in the nature of the debate. And that presents both threats and opportunities in terms of the way we communicate with those people and the way we try and make the case for our industry.
Matthew?
I think the level of ignorance about food systems and agriculture is deeply concerning. We become globally a more urban-based population in both the developing and developed worlds. That disconnect from understanding what it takes to get food onto the plate is concerning. A chemical phobia that goes against every bit of evidence about why they should be embraced, instead being concerned of, which, quite frankly, I think it's the chemical phobia that's going to kill us in the developed world, not the chemicals. And again, I think just a complete misunderstanding and an ignorance, particularly in urban-based communities, about plant science generally. Hence, the last component of it, being GM, a more precise and a crucial tool, seems to be the thing they've got scared about. And I think that is something that the industry and agriculture more broadly need to get back to engaging in the debate.
Let's ask everybody here, including the panel. Hands up if it's all the fault of the media. Let's just get that bit over and done with, hey?
Oh, you've swayed them, Charlotte. You've swayed them.
I'm scared of you.
No, be honest. There's only one of me and there are loads of you.
Contributing factor.
Yes. Okay, contributing factor, the media. Hands up. Given the situation as you see it, what do you do? Is there a change in approach, and does it need to come from your industry or from somewhere else, Nick?
I wouldn't say the change in approach is needed now from our industry. I think probably was recognised comparatively recently that the industry had been very slow historically to get on the front foot and be positive and proactive about being proud about what it does, what it did and what it does. I think there has been a recognition over, say, 5 to 10 years that actually the industry needs to be much more forward about that, and I think there are attempts to do that. It's a slow process, and it's particularly slow because the industry failed to do the groundwork, in the preceding decades. But I certainly, I wouldn't say that there's nothing being done. I think actually there is a lot of effort and work being done to promote the technologies that the industry produces. I think, the media is a question is a tough one. I think not least because actually it's not just one homogenous, blob all taking the same views. I mean, you've got the trade media, which tend to be obviously much more balanced, objective than the national media, and I think that's where the problem lies. It's those non-specialist journalists and reporters in national outlets, whether it's print media or broadcast, but particularly the print media, who probably are under pressure to turn over copy pretty quickly. They need a big headline, and that's what they chase. And often we get the tough end of the stick from that.
Have you changed how you communicate?
As a scientist, we certainly put more thought into it now, because I guess personally I've experienced sometimes the work that's being produced being reinterpreted by journalists using lots of emotive words which we didn't use to describe the original work, and seeing some backlash from the beekeeping community, because actually for the last 10 years, and most of the last 10 years, I've been working in bee health and not crop health. I have seen it, and for me it really comes down to the language that you use to describe. You can describe exactly the same process, exactly the same technology in two different ways. In one way will get a round of applause and a standing ovation from a room full of beekeepers, and the other way will get you thrown out. And it can be exactly the same thing you're describing. So you have to be really careful, yes.
So it's the spin.
In a way, and sometimes you find yourself involved in a press release which has spin associated with it, just to try to prevent the counterspin, because you think that that's going to come as a result. So, yeah, you do have to think about these things.
Do you think there's a difference, Richard, between pesticides and GM crops in this? Would you make them two separate entities in this discussion?
I think they are slightly different, yes, because obviously pesticides are older and they're seen more as a chemical contaminant, which many people don't really see as necessary. Whereas on the GM side, it's more complex because it may be a contaminant in the food to some people, and it's also the effect on the environment as well, from the way that GM crops are used with herbicides, for example.
And do you think that you've, as an industry, have proved the need for GM crops, particularly those that would be grown here?
I don't think the public are convinced that there's a need for GM crops, no. But we saw earlier this morning that the amount of GM crops that are grown, particularly in Latin America, how widespread soya and maize, etc. are. And the public, if they actually took that on board, would be horrified initially. But they may start to accept the fact that we are already eating a lot of GM crops. And as far as we know, there's no negative health effect yet.
Matthew, how does this debate differ in Australia?
Well, these issues are both combined on occasions and also separate in the debate. And it goes to... I disagree with Giles on one thing about a general reluctance to accept technology. In fact, you see a massive adoption of it. You'll find a smartphone in everybody's hand in this room. The way that's been adopted around the world is phenomenal. I think the difference here is, one, it's about food. We're putting it into our bodies. And secondly, the industry has never put it in a genuine end consumer value proposition context. It's been about direct client, customer proposition to the farmers. They use it. They know the benefits of both sides of the products. There's a third factor. There's a marketing force. It's in the food and grocery sector. Single largest growing sector, even though it's still small globally, 3%, is organics. It's very profitable. It's 30% margins compared to other profits. So there is a market force here that's being driven. And in fact, if you look at the history of marketing organics, it is about making you afraid of the alternatives. Organics is just another farming system. It's one supported by our industry. I mean, there's a view in urban environments that somehow, organics is only touched by the feet of fairies and nothing goes on it, as opposed to the reality of huge amounts of chemicals go on it. They're just not synthetic. And in fact, even globally, synthetic chemicals can be used by exception if they have disease outbreaks. So it's actually, I think, a side of the marketing strategy of organics is predominantly about scaring people. If I may, Charlotte, I want to just bring up a quick photo to highlight how crazy this is. The top sign is an actual sign from Whole Foods. One of the most ridiculous things I'd ever seen. No factual base. The sign that I had one of my staff redo would be a more scientifically valid sign that should be displayed if they're concerned. I don't know if you could read it, but the Whole Foods marketing sign was, "This grinder is used for both organic and conventionally grown coffee beans. Those customers who are passionate about maintaining the organic integrity of their coffee may want to consider grinding beans at home." I mean, seriously. Really, whereas the proper evidence-based sign should be, "This grinder is used for both organic and conventional coffee beans. Those consumers are worried about the increased risk of exposure to disease-causing bacteria such as E. coli, which is more common, 8 times actually more common statistically in organic food, may wish to consider grinding their conventional beans at home."
I don't want to get into the which is better, which is safer, which is... Let's be really cynical and just look at the way the two are presented at the marketing. Have they just outplayed you? And is that why you're cross?
Well, I mean, no. I mean, I think still. Well, I mean, I have a specifically UK perspective, and in the UK, actually, organic farming is falling in terms of land area covered by it, and the market is, I think maybe this year, maybe there was a small growth, but I mean, after many years. Of falling, so and it's still 97-98% of farms in the UK are conventional farms. So I think we have to put it in perspective in that case. And actually, I think also we've got to be careful about beating ourselves up too much as an industry. If we go back to the neonic debate we talked about earlier this morning, the UK government took a negotiating position into Europe to oppose the ban.
And they've changed their mind on that,
well,
to be fair.
I'm not sure they have, but...
That's what they told me.
They haven't told it to me yet. But
we've got a breaking story. BBC's breaking it.
But the point is that actually, the way that sometimes you hear the discussion going, it's as if, everybody apart from, maybe the farming industry, crop protection industry and associated industries, thought these things are, think these things are bad and were out to ban them. Actually, the decision made on a UK basis was not that at all, and actually the industry's position was adopted by the government. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in Brussels, and it didn't happen in a number of EU member states. It did happen in others. So there's it's not, as I say, we've got to be careful not to beat ourselves up too much about this. Actually, we have been proven to make the case well at times. We've got to do it better. We've got to keep improving and thinking of better ways of doing that. But actually, as I said at the very beginning, I think over the last 5-10 years, we are better at making the case, and we need to improve.
Anybody who wants to make a comment or an interjection, just wave your arms around, and the glamorous assistant will come running towards you, won't you, with a microphone. I just want to bring up something that somebody mentioned to me in the coffee break there, and they were saying that if you go to a meeting in Europe, you will see all the NGOs there lobbying. You will see them all doing press releases and so on afterwards. But you lot aren't there. Are you missing a trick on the lobbying front, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was talking to a few people about this a bit earlier on. I don't know if people are familiar with something called a veracity index. I don't know if that's something that people have heard of before, but there's an annual survey that's carried out. It's an independent survey where they ask more than 1,000 members of the general public whether or not they trust a certain profession more or less. Have you seen this one?
No.
You may have.
I don't think I want to, do I?
You might not want to, but let's have some fun with it anyway. But one of the things one of the questions they ask is would you trust what a journalist would say? And 22% of people would trust a journalist. Okay, so whereas if you were the anchor of a news programme, then 67% of people would trust what you said. But and it flips around a bit as well with coming back to the question, because if I was to sit here as a government scientist, as a civil servant, 55% of people would believe what I said. If I was to sit here as an industry representative, a scientist again, but as an industry representative, 22% of people would believe what I said. And if I was an independent scientist or independent scientist at a university, 83% of people would believe what I said. So when you talk about going along, setting up your banners, and actually the general public will already have a natural dissuasion to believe certain sections of the public, depending on what their profession is, and politicians fare worse than journalists, you'll be here,
And probably estate agents at the bottom, yeah. Is that a problem? Because you appear on Farming Today from time to time and on the other programmes. And you are an industry representative. So what was it? How many people are believing what he says? 20-something?
22, I think.
I mean, this is the point I'm making, is I think there's an error if we simply think, well, the way to do it is the industry has to stand up and, make a noise and defend itself. It's much more, not complicated, but it's more nuanced than that. And actually, where we are in the UK is with a farming industry generally pretty who recognise the importance of crop protection. They also, in the UK, recognise the potential of GM and are willing to stand up and make the case. Not across the board, but actually, generally in the UK, the farming industry is quite supportive. And I don't know how farmers came out in that survey, if they were included, but actually the NFU carry out farmer opinion surveys amongst the public about farmer reputation, and they come out very high. I think sort of in the 80% usually in terms of trusted profession. So actually working closely. This is not sort of dark arts or anything. Working closely with farmers, with others, with independent scientists and others to explain the facts, to explain the benefits, and to encourage them to advocate on behalf of the industry is important. It's more important in a way than trying to rally the industry itself to stand up in very difficult circumstances and make the case and be seen as a vested interest in doing so.
But there was a parliamentary... Sorry, Matthew.
I was just saying, but equally from our perspective, as an industry, as the plant science sector covering both sides, there is no conflict. The organic sector are a significant customer base for our industry on the chemical side, as much as the other. The problem is that in some food marketing tools, they've sought to make this conflict. Organics is just another farming system, as is modern conventional, as is technology-based. There doesn't need to be this conflict. They all have a role. Globally, we see that the three farming systems can coexist perfectly, and as long as you don't have bizarre organic marketing rules put in place that put zero thresholds for GM in place. Of course, Australia's the only country that has that. We're looking to correct that, so we have some problems. And therein lies the problem, is that then the marketing turns it into some lifestyle choice, as opposed to understanding it's just another farming system.
The UK Parliament report earlier this year in the spring recommended that the government reframe the public conversation on GMs. Has anyone noticed a reframing? Hands up. One. Okay. Why do you think... microphone. What do you think has changed in the way that we are debating GMs? Sorry, gentleman just down here.
I think there's a need to cast off GM and GM crops and start using new terminology for the new exciting genetic technologies that we are going to be using in pest control and crop improvement. Gene silencing, gene editing, and related technologies. Why do we have to go back to GMO and GM crops, where the GM technology was essentially used to sell more chemicals? Let's stop that and start using new terms, and let's introduce the new technologies under a new light.
Would that work?
It may, but I think, again, the public would be very suspicious of renaming something that was bad, such as nuclear power plants.
Sellafield all over again.
Yeah. I think it needs to be well explained that the sort of technology we're talking about is trying to sort of do express plant breeding, that sort of thing. It's not introducing something totally foreign into a plant. It's a way of doing plant breeding more rapidly, and the benefits of that.
So in a way, being more technical in your explanation to the consumer, me.
Potentially, I think I'll come back to Nick's point that it's very much about stating the benefits. Okay, I talked at the start about how sometimes people could be fearful of new technologies. Sometimes that's fearful of how new technologies operate and how they work. Sometimes it's because they don't see a benefit to it. And you brought it back to smartphones. Well, people see real benefit from using smartphones. Yep. So they decided to put some of the research that suggested you get brain cancer from using mobile phones in the early days to one side because it was that much more useful to them than not having one. And actually, we really need to concentrate on explaining to people what the benefits are, what the need is. And until we can really get that across, I think, maybe thinking about different names is helpful. But until we can explain what the actual benefit is of some of these technologies, then I think we're going to struggle.
Should you, as the CPA, have done more of that, Nick?
Possibly. I mean, possibly. I think that's right, but I think it's half of the approach, because actually, with substances or products or whatever it might be, where people detect some level of risk, yes, they are interested. They might be interested in the benefits. What they're really interested in is their own safety, or the potential impact on the environment, or whatever it might be. So I would be concerned about, you could explain, for example, back to the nuclear power plant analogy, how great this is in terms of energy security, etc., etc. If the guy living next to the power plant is concerned about what the effect of living next to a nuclear power plant might be, he doesn't really care about those benefit arguments. He wants to be reassured about safety. So it's really two-pronged, and I think we maybe need to do more on both. But actually, at the same time as explaining benefits, we really need to explain to people, and I think there's a real lack of understanding in the public in general about the regulatory process, the approvals process for crop protection products, for example, go through the work that we do with farmers in ensuring the way they're used is responsible, etc., to allay those concerns. And I think until you've done that, it's difficult to get any traction with the benefits. Nevertheless, it is important.
We are officially out of time, but I just want very briefly to raise something which may have an impact, particularly on pesticides, which is the WHO and glyphosate. How much has that being identified as a carcinogen, which is a word I cannot say, how much is that going to have an impact, not just on glyphosate, but actually beyond?
It's going to have a massive effect. Because talking to certain regulators, they're sort of sceptical about the classification that's been achieved. But if it's going to be carried forward as a carcinogen, then obviously it'll be banned, and that'll have a massive impact on world agriculture. Then that sort of sets a precedent for looking for the next chemical, which could be identified as a potential carcinogen or other toxic mechanism. So maybe it starts the ball rolling as a way of trying to eliminate certain compounds that the public may perceive as being unnecessary.
And Giles, in a perception way, it I suppose backs up that chemicals are bad feeling.
Yes, potentially. Yeah, I guess potentially it does. Carcinogen. People have actually, quite a lot of people are familiar with that term as a cancer-causing product. So yeah, it's not going to help, is it? So, and it would be, as Richard said, make a huge impact, glyphosate.
Yeah, Matthew spoke very eloquently earlier about, the tactics that some NGOs and some activists take, globally on these issues. And I think the really concerning thing about the WHO report is the way that actually it's been taken up by campaigners and NGOs and misused. I mean, the IARC, the committee who produced it, themselves explained that it wasn't a risk assessment, but it is being used, as such, despite the fact that there are a whole load of regulatory agencies around the world who've come to different conclusions, and that's the challenge.
Isn't that the problem, though, right there? That most of us hear glyphosate, cancer, and that's probably what we hear. Yeah. And so when you say all that, it sounds a little bit like weasel words from the industry, which has a vested interest.
We need to do more to explain. It goes back to what I was saying about the safety element of what we do, that this is a product which has gone through decades of assessment through regulators across the globe, and has, essentially been considered nearly in all of those processes as safe. And so this is an absolute outlier in that sense. But it's actually not doing the same thing. It's not. It itself agrees that it's not a risk assessment. We could go into a whole different conversation about public attitudes to risk versus hazard and their understanding of those very difficult things. But I suspect we won't.
This was an appalling misuse of a report. It's a complete misunderstanding of the IARC Committee's report. They've already sought to clarify it somewhat, and I expect the World Health Organization is now under enough pressure from global regulators to make a clarifying statement. This is not about, let's be clear, the same committee has allocated aloe vera as a possible carcinogen as well. Well, there's a product that my mother puts on her face every day, is entirely unregulated, and quite frankly, if anyone needs to getting worried about anything, get onto aloe vera. This was a misunderstanding of what IARC do and what their assessments are about, and plays no context in the regulated proper use of glyphosate. But, Charlotte, as you pointed out, the debate is in that space because people use that and use a misunderstanding of these scientific processes and reports to achieve a policy or political outcome.
And there I think we'll have to leave it. Does anyone... we have some comments.
Okay, Katie Barrett in Vigo. So are burnt barbecued meats and burnt toast as carcinogens. And again, I remember being with Bayer, we did a wonderful publication, Pesticides in Perspective. We listed the LD50s of things like toothpaste all the way through. And again, it's putting it in perspective. And I think the crop protection industry has to step up to the mark and, meet it head on.
Well, there's a challenge for you. That, I'm afraid, is all we have time for because we are a little bit over time. Thank you all very much for your attention today.